guys, welcome to this week's episode of I Didn't Sign Up for This. I am so excited because today we are chatting with Paige Turner, and I'm sure many of you guys already follow her, but if you're not, you're going to after you listen to her interview because she is honestly one of a kind and she never holds back. Her content is so genuine and authentic. She just calls it how it is. So I'm really excited to chat with Paige today. We're going to be talking about the invisible labor, domestic work, how to have more quality in your relationship, if that's something that you're struggling with. So, welcome, Paige.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah. And for those who don't already follow you, can you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
I am a working mom of four kids, and I started creating content about 2 years ago now, just for fun. And then I struck a chord on a few different things, and now it's a big part of what I do. And I talk a lot about, as you said, invisible labor, the mental load, and I really focus in on the inequities that often exist in heterosexual marriages between men and women, and how that can bleed into our lives as working moms in particular, and all the things that we have to navigate, childcare and parental leave and all those things that nobody really told us before we had kids. And so yeah, I talk about all of that on Instagram and TikTok, and yeah, that's where you'll find me.
Yeah, I love that so much. And I was going to ask you how you started posting on social media. So you just started just posting just for fun and then it just kind of blew up.
So I was a social media lurker. Like, I didn't post anything on my own Instagram. It was like you're gonna see one post every 6 months of one of my kids, maybe, and or my husband, I don't know, or a dog. I just wasn't on social media in that way. But my company where I worked at the time did a lot of growth marketing, and we were seeing some interesting results from TikTok. And we were selling clothing. And so anytime there was a viral video, the founder was really fun and funny and made these like weird videos that, as we all know, TikTok loves weird. So he would go viral and we'd see amazing sales. And so I started to explore TikTok, and I was a lurker. I was on TikTok, but never, ever thought I'd post on TikTok, and just started posting. I posted one video to get a feel for the app, and I don't know, it got a conversation started, and I was like, oh, this is cool. This is kind of fun. It's different than Instagram, and it sucked me in, and I really liked it, and I was having fun. But yeah, about 6 months in, I mean, Caitlin knows what this is like, but I went viral for the first time, and I was like, whoa, okay. But I went viral talking about childcare and the cost of childcare and the impacts on my life as a working mom. And I really just learned how much people want to talk about this and how much people don't know about it. And I know so much, I just couldn't stop talking about it. And so, yeah, that's kind of how it happened. It really was very organic. I didn't have any intention to grow this platform in this way, but I'm very glad that I did.
I think that I'm really glad that you did too, because you talk about so many things that matter to parents. I mean, women mainly, and so many things that like we didn't know was going to be part of being a mother. Like, childcare. That's not what this topic is about today, but I mean, it's a huge issue, right? Like, there's so many things that women are affected by in motherhood, and a lot of people are afraid to talk about those things because one doesn't. You don't want to seem like you're complaining about being a mom
Right.
because of course we love being a mom, but it's like these are also things that are really hard. Parenthood does affect mothers more than men. It does seem in many ways.
Hmm.
We'll get into this more, but there's a lot of inequalities that happen within the household, even when there are two working parents. And that's something that a lot of women are experiencing. So I'm so
Yes.
glad that you started posting because you talk about everything and you never hold anything back. And that is really just a breath of fresh air.
Thank you. I think it's funny because people say that to me all the time, and I told Caitlin this because Caitlin and I were roomies at a conference.
Yes, we
And
were.
I think some of that has to do with where I'm from. So I'm from Massachusetts, and it's just kind of how everyone I know is, right? We all just are saying everything out loud all the time, and for better or for worse. And so I didn't realize that this was maybe not the way everybody was talking in their day-to-day lives. And so I'm glad that people feel that and relate to the content. But I was so surprised by that commentary when I first started posting. I was like, oh, I don't know, this is just kind of how I communicate.
I
And for
know
you
it's
it
funny.
was different.
I know I've seen some videos that you've posted where it's usually like a response to someone
Mm.
else commenting
Yeah.
on your video. And you're like, this is just how we talk in Massachusetts. And I'm from Utah. And like everyone in Utah is just like so overly nice and kind, but
Mm.
like we just like kind of gossip like behind closed doors and like shit talk, but we're like nice everyone's face. So it is like, it's just crazy like seeing like the differences, where people grew
Totally.
up and how they speak. And it's like, this isn't necessarily like me being negative or being aggressive. It's just how we speak.
Yeah. This is how I grew up. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but yeah, so I mean but I do take that into my content. I try not to sugarcoat it. I try not to gloss over or make it, for better or for worse. There's a lot of commentary online about like, let's show the good parts of motherhood. And I think there's so many amazing parts of motherhood, but for so long we haven't talked about any of the hard stuff. And so then we go into it blind. And I know I felt really angry when I became a mom that nobody warned me about all these things.
Yeah.
Once I had the words, once I started talking about it, I was no longer angry because I felt like I could do something about it. And I think that's an important part of the mental load and all of this, which is if we don't talk about it, then it goes unaddressed and it builds up and it creates resentment and frustration and burnout ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, let's talk about the domestic and invisible labor. I know that there's sometimes confusion around what
Mm,
the difference is between just regular, like things that you're doing for the kids and around the house and what's actually invisible. Those get mixed up
mm.
a lot. So, how do those two things differ?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to think about it, right? When you think about domestic labor, you're thinking laundry, cooking, cleaning, mowing the lawn, all of these things, right? Inside, outside, anything that you're doing to maintain your home and your family life is domestic labor. It's what you have to do. And it's really not gendered, even though our society genders a lot of it. But domestic labor is that work, those chores as we grew up knowing them, right? All of these chores that we have to do, especially as adults. The invisible labor is oftentimes there's two ways I like to think about it. There's the invisible labor that kind of falls into the mental load bucket, the thinking, planning, conceptualizing of all of these tasks. Making dinner is a task, knowing what you have in the pantry and in the fridge, what meat is expiring, what your kids actually will or will not eat. That's the mental load. And that's all invisible. You're doing this work in your head. And even when you make dinner and your kid squirts that last thing of ketchup, you have a mental note. Okay, we need ketchup. I have to add it to the list. And that's the mental work. And that's totally invisible. Nobody sees what's going on in your brain unless you're one of those people who narrates it all day long, right? So nobody sees that work, but it's happening, especially with mothers, all of the time. This running checklist in your brain of all the things you need to know and do and remember. Remembering that your daughter's favorite stuffy got dirty and it has to be washed. Remembering that you have a birthday party this weekend and you haven't wrapped the present. It's all of these things. Then there's invisible labor in the sense that so much of the domestic labor is carried by women oftentimes. The data shows that even when a woman is a breadwinner, she still does more domestic labor oftentimes in her home. And so much of this can be invisible because what happens is it's happening behind the scenes, right? I work from home. I know you do too. I fold laundry every single day for my daughters and my son. I do one load of laundry a day and I fold it while I'm answering emails or on a call. Like I'm always doing laundry. I'm making kids lunches. My husband sees none of that. He comes home, the kids' closets are full of clean clothes. The lunches are in the fridge. The counters are clean. The floors are swept. All of these things look beautiful. Everything looks great, but he didn't see any of the work that went into it. And so he could essentially come home and be like, "So what'd you do today?" And not see that I did all of this work, right? And so I saw it, I did it. It's very real. But oftentimes, if somebody's not responsible for it, accountable to it, and they don't actually see it happening, they don't see the value and they don't acknowledge it as real work because they didn't see it happening. And so I think of invisible labor in those two parts where it's like there's the mental load and then there's the fact that sometimes people don't see the work, they just see the end result.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, everything that you just said is so relatable. I mean, I'm thinking in my mind right now, I need to clean my daughter's stuffy, which is disgusting. We just had a
Always.
birthday party for my oldest. Yes. And it's just like the things of like just buying a present and like putting like thought into that and being like, this
Mm-hmm.
is what she already has. This is what she likes. This is what she's into. It's like just keeping tabs on everything at all times. And it doesn't seem I feel like sometimes when I'm talking to Cody, and he's great, we've made a lot of progress in this area over the last couple of years since we got divorced. And then he kind of, and we'll get more into that. But once like we got divorced and he was a single dad, he was like,
Wow.
this is a lot. Like I did not realize how much you were doing. So we made a lot of progress here. But sometimes when I'm explaining it to him and I'm like planning her birthday party, it like doesn't sound like that big of a deal. It's like go online and just book the trampoline park. Like it takes 5 seconds, right? But it's like so much more than that. And so sometimes when you're expressing it to your partner, it seems petty, but it's really not when it's just like all these things at once, right?
It's not. My daughter's birthday is this weekend, or her birthday party. Her
Okay.
birthday's not this weekend.
Yeah.
So I am also in the throes of planning a 4-year-old's birthday party. And it's not as simple, right, as just booking the venue, which is what I did. That's part of what I did. But it was looking at that, comparing prices, checking the dates. What do we have on that date? What sports do we have on that date? Can her best friend come? Because if her best friend can't come, she's going to be like devastated. Okay, find the date, book the date, pay for it. Now you're sending out invitations and checking who's actually coming and confirming with the venue and ordering pizza and making a cake or buying a cake. And my daughter's allergic to eggs, so I always need a second thing because she can't have the regular cake because it has eggs in it. And so it's the goodie bags, it's all of the things, right? And I even have a reminder, I'm looking at it on my other monitor, that says, don't forget candle and lighter for birthday cake, right? Because it's the little things, right, that you're always thinking about. And so it's, yes, is it a lot of work? Maybe it's not hours and hours and hours of work, but somebody has to do it. Somebody has to think about it. Somebody has to constantly be remembering those things. And yeah, my husband, this is not something he owns in our house. This is something I own. So he's going to show up to this birthday party and all the things will be there. And he's not really going to know how that happened because, we've worked in our house to divide domestic labor in a way that feels equitable. This is something I own. This is something I own. He doesn't need to know these things. But a few years ago, I would have been pissed. I would have been so mad because I was owning everything, including birthday parties, and it was going completely unacknowledged. And that just feels so frustrating because you know how hard you work on all of these things.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy that you could be using doing something for yourself.
Yes.
I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Well, a lot about this actually, because I know when we met, when we were in Nashville and we were little roomies, and I know you've talked about this on social as well, but you have made a lot of progress in your own relationship with your husband on this specific
Mm-hmm.
issue. I know a lot of women are affected by this, myself included. And I've had a lot of people reach out to me now that Cody and I are back in a relationship, trying to make it work. I've shared a little bit about kind of what we've done on our end. And so I've had a lot of people ask specifically about this, like, okay, how did you get here? And I mean, I got divorced, so that's not really good advice for people. So I'm like, I have to bring Paige on because she's the expert and she knows, she has personal experience with this and she talks about it all the time. So I want to talk about your experience with domestic invisible labor, the mental load. How did you get to a place where there was more equity in your relationship?
Sure. Yeah. And I think that word's really important that you just use, Caitlin, which is equity, right? I think a lot of people get confused in this conversation that we need everything to be 50-50 or equal. It's just not possible. Like, it's not possible in any relationship ever because life and jobs and illness and all the things, right? And so when we have this conversation, I want people to remember that, right? Nobody's ever going to be 50-50. But for me, I became a mom 6 months before the pandemic. We were foster parents to two toddlers and ultimately adopted them a year later. But in that time, I became pregnant. And so we went from no kids to 4 kids in 3.5 years. Like, it was like a whirlwind. And during that time, because I worked from home and my husband was a first responder, the domestic labor and work of children really fell to me because I was physically with them every time we were locked down or in quarantine or anything. It was just me, right? And I would work from home while taking care of toddlers and pregnant with a baby. And after our fourth child, I woke up one day and my husband, I had been complaining about domestic labor, saying, "Hey, I've got 4 kids to get ready by myself every single morning for school. And then I have to work at 9. And when you forget to take out the trash or you don't help empty the dishwasher, it just creates more work for me. And my mornings are already chaotic enough by myself with 4 kids." And I woke up one morning and I went to throw out a diaper in the diaper trash, and it was so full that I couldn't empty it. And when I tried to empty it, I sliced my finger open. So, like, I'm bleeding. I have a 2-month-old on my chest, a 2-year-old crying. Like, I'm just like, okay, deep breaths, Paige, take deep breaths. And I went downstairs and the dishwasher wasn't unloaded, and like all the things I needed were inside of it. And I felt so unseen by him, and I felt disrespected. I felt like he thought my time was not nearly as valuable as his time because his excuse was I was running late for work. But because he didn't do all of those things, now I'm running late for work because he didn't do his part, right? And mind you, all he had to do was wake up and go to work by himself. He didn't have to take care of anyone. I had to take care of 4 kids and get to work on time. And so I was at a point where I was ready to get divorced. I was like, I would rather do this alone than do this with you here and not see me, because I felt like I'd been talking about it for months. And I hear that from women all the time. I talk about this constantly. We've been fighting and having the same fight for years, and he doesn't change. That was what was happening. I knew my husband loved me. I knew he wanted us to be happy. And I knew he kept trying to change, but he just wasn't doing it. And that was my breaking point. I was sad, but I was totally okay if divorce was the answer because I couldn't continue on in this unequal relationship where I not only worked full time making very similar money, but was bearing the burden of childcare and domestic labor. And so I said to him, we're changing something. Something is changing. And so we did a couple things. One, we started doing couples therapy. So if you have the means to do it, I think that's important. And that was for not just domestic labor. That was for everything, that we were going through. But we also started working on the domestic labor portion. And the catalyst for us, or for me in particular, was reading the book Fair Play by Eve Rodsky. And I don't think it's a perfect book and I don't think it's a perfect method. But for me, it was this light bulb moment of being able to find the words to put to what I was feeling. She labeled things like the mental load and domestic labor and these inequities. She showed the numbers. She made it so that I could understand that I wasn't actually crazy. Because I think so many women feel like that. Am I a nag? Am I crazy? Like, are my expectations too high? Am I asking too much? And it's like, no, you're not asking too much. Actually, if you look at the numbers just on paper, you'll see that you're doing far more work, maybe, than your male counterpart in this marriage. And so we did Fair Play, and Fair Play is this game where you essentially, she does it via a deck of cards. I do it through an Excel spreadsheet, but you have 100 tasks, maybe. You see who has which ones, and you look at them, right? You look at your piles of cards or your Excel spreadsheet, and my stack was like 70 and his was like 12. And I was like, does this feel fair? This doesn't feel fair, right? That started our journey working towards this equity, working towards teaching him, which sucks that I had to do that, but what the mental load is, right? He would come home from school with a backpack of, our daughter had an accident, as they do when they're potty training, right? And he'd be like, oh, I emptied it out. I put it in the washing machine. I put her backpack back. And I'm like, great. What's the last step? And he's like, what? And I'm like, you need to send new underwear back to school.
Yep.
You have to send more clothes back to school. You can't, the project didn't end here, right? It didn't end here. And
Mm-hmm.
we spent probably 2 years going through this work. And I'll tell you, I really hated my husband for a period of time. Like, I just genuinely didn't like him because of all of this. I resented him. I was unhappy. I'd say like a year and a half into it, I no longer felt like that. It really felt like this, just like the stress lifted. I felt like I had a true partnership. I felt like I had a partner who, if I disappeared tomorrow, could take care of my kids and our home. And that feels good to know that you truly have this counterpart. And I'll say this, it's not equal. I still do much more in the way of childcare and in domestic labor because of the nature of how our home works and his job, but it feels a lot better. And yeah, that was kind of our journey. And I know people don't like to talk, and I'm sure you know this, Caitlin, but like, divorce should never be on the table. And it's like, well, sometimes it is, because I
Yeah.
think, it's not okay. It shouldn't be okay for one person to go through it feeling so unfulfilled and so frustrated and resentful and unseen, because that's not fair, right? And we want everybody to be happy in marriage. And I think change is possible if you have a willing and able partner who loves you and wants you to be happy, and vice versa. Right? I think that's the starting point, is having that.
Yeah. Oh man, that's beautiful. I have so many thoughts about everything that you just said. I mean, first thing that comes to my mind is like, was your husband always on board? Did it sounded like he was always like willing to try, willing to like change. He
Mm-hmm.
wanted to, he just didn't really know where to start. I feel like that's half the battle in the
Yeah.
relationship is like just getting your partner on board. If they want to change, like here's a strategy, but do you have any tips for anyone if their partner maybe is like resistant towards doing fair
Oh.
play or any type of method talking about it changing?
Yeah, so he was resistant. I mean, he was always amenable to, like, he'd be like, I just want you to be happy. Like, tell me what to do to make you happy and I'll do it. And I'm like, I don't want to give you a list. I was that wife
Yeah,
who yelled,
a
don't
list.
ask me for a list. Like, just do the
Yeah,
thing.
please.
I was like, oh my God, you don't get it. And he kept being like, we don't need a game. We don't need therapy. Like, I'll do better. And it just didn't ever get better. And he would say, like, what, I can empathize with him, which is that when I would come to him and say, you need to do more, he would hear, you're a bad dad, you're a bad husband, you suck. Like, and that's not what I was saying. And I would say that to him. I'm like, listen to the words that I'm saying. I'm saying that I need support. I'm saying I need you to be more active. I'm saying I need you to own more of these things. Not once did I say you're a bad dad or a bad husband. I'm just telling you what I need from you. But he was, yeah, I mean, it hurt his ego. It hurt his ego, and that was hard. I will say, I probably didn't go into it with a lot of grace. I didn't go into it like I would just like, it'd be a fight and I would something would happen and I would get angry and say like, how do you not see this? And it would be a fight. And it wasn't the best way to do it. I think the best thing you can do is have these conversations young. I mean, you and I both got married young. These patterns, if I look back, these patterns of behavior started when we were teenagers because I met my husband when I was like 14. This started well before kids. It just didn't feel so heavy until kids showed up. It just didn't. But if I were to go back now and look, I would have been able to identify along the way all the ways in which I was making his life easier and not allowing him to learn what the work really was and to see the consequences of not following through on it. But my best advice is go into it with good intentions. Don't go into it expecting them to be mad or expecting it to be a fight. Try to go into it with good intent on both sides, which is we both want to be happy. We both want to have a home that functions like a well-oiled machine. We don't want to keep having a fight about the laundry. Like this is a silly fight. So if you can go into it with that intent and do your best to recognize the patterns of what's happening and have these conversations in moments that are not heightened, I think it goes a lot better. But not to say you shouldn't have examples, but it's not always the best to have the conversation in the moment because it's too heated and everybody's just trying to protect themselves in those moments. And you can have a little bit more clarity and grace for one another and more of a controlled environment. But it takes time. I think it takes time and it
Yeah.
takes a lot of empathy for one another.
Yeah, I think so too. I just know that like when you're burned out and you are exhausted and it's just so easy to just
There's no patience.
snap,
Yeah.
And like
Yeah.
when you do, and I'm thinking about my own experience too. Like I met Cody when I was 17. We got married, I was 22, and then we didn't have kids till I was 27. So we had 5 years of marriage before we even had kids. But based on like what was modeled to me, like I kind of took that on and it wasn't that big of a
Mm-hmm.
deal. I honestly never really thought about it until we had kids, until we had two kids. And then I was like,
Mm-hmm.
and I was working full time. And I
Yeah.
was like, okay, like how am I going to go back to work? I was on maternity leave and I was like, I am so overwhelmed and I'm not even working right now. I'm on maternity leave. How am I going to go back to work and do all of these things? And I had to iron his clothes because he was in court at the time at
Oh,
his
yeah.
job. And so I was like ironing his clothes. And I just remember being like, I like something's got to give. Like I cannot do all these things. And that was actually one of the first videos that I did that went viral, was talking about the mental load many years ago, where I was ironing his shirt and then I just listed all of the things that were going through my mind as I was ironing the clothes. And I had two little kids just on the floor, like
Oh my
grabbing at the
gosh.
iron, trying to get me. And I was just like on the verge of a mental breakdown. But I feel like that's usually when these conversations come up, is when you are kind of like at rock bottom, like you can't take it anymore. Cause sometimes it does just feel easier. Just do it. It's easier for me to do it rather than explain to him how to teach him how to do
Mm-hmm.
it, or like coach him through like whatever word that you want to use. Sometimes it does just feel easier until it's just not easy. And then it just blows up.
Exactly. And I think if we notice those patterns of behavior before kids, if we can, right? I think, I met my husband when I was 16 and I would like do his homework because he was bad at it. And I'd be like, okay, I'm just gonna do this. So it's done. And then we can go out and go hang out. Right. And I wasn't doing it to make his life easier necessarily. I wanted to make my life easier. Right. But that pattern of behavior continued into college when he lived with his friends and I'd come over and be like, oh my God, you haven't done laundry. I'm going to be a nice girlfriend. I'm going to do it for you because then we can go do our own stuff and not have to think about like the mess that's existing in this house with four boys. And we started to do those things. And we also, I think, buy into this idea and we're shown this idea a lot of what it looks like to be a wife and to play house, right? Like when we first moved in together, I'm like, this is fun. I don't know. I like cooking you a nice dinner. And I think it's nice that you get to come home sometimes and your laundry is done. But what I didn't realize is that over time, of kindness and things like that turn into expectations. And then when you have children, my husband and I were I felt like we were pretty equitable before kids, but we lived in an apartment and then we lived in a small house and then we had kids and then we moved into a big house with a bigger yard and all this stuff, right? But the kid stuff, the kid work, it multiplies. I mean, you have one kid and it's not just one extra load of laundry, it's two. And then you have two kids and now it's like four loads of laundry. And it's not, you know,
Yeah.
what once felt equitable, me doing laundry and him mowing the lawn, no longer felt equitable. Like, how did I get responsible for 7 loads of laundry and you do 1 hour of the lawn a week? Like, what?
Yeah.
That's
I'd rather do the
crazy.
lawn.
Oh my God, I would rather, he's got a nice ride on. Like, he puts his headphones on.
He has a ride on. Okay. That's even better.
Yeah, I'm like, "Hey, teach me how to use that thing. I'll go out there any day." Like, I'll trade
Yeah.
big time.
My gosh. Okay. Well, I'm trying to think if there was anything else in what you said. I think it's really important, yeah, for these conversations and this is like another reason why it's so important to talk about this on social media is because I mean, obviously everyone's on social media, but especially like Gen Z, these are people who don't have kids yet or they're just getting married. And it's like these are
Yeah.
conversations that need to have before you get into the thick of having kids if you want to have a happy and successful marriage because a lot of people are getting divorced and having
Mhm.
issues in the relationship because of things like this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is a huge reason why a lot of women get divorced. They don't want to be what they consider like a single married mother, right? And I think, I worked with a bunch of Gen Z women. I worked for a very Gen Z brand, and they're eyes wide open, which I think is amazing. They're following moms on TikTok. I get DMs all the time, and they're like, "I'm 24 and I'm learning so much." And I'm like, man, I wish somebody was talking about this when I was 24, but instead I was seeing the like, this is a fun arts and craft for your kid, right? From the moms before me
Right.
on Instagram, the aesthetic moms on Instagram. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
I think apps, especially like TikTok, though, have really opened up the world for Gen Z, and they just have so much more access to information. And I do think that they're going into it with a more well-rounded viewpoint of the realities of motherhood, and they know the word the mental load. I didn't know that word until I started breaking down. Essentially, I was like, what's happening? I didn't know the word. And so I think I'm really hopeful for women who come after us that they're going to hopefully be able to advocate for themselves more and just understand what could happen if we don't do the work of making sure it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. I was also thinking about the pandemic and how I think that changed a lot of things for women
Oh yeah, for
because
sure.
everyone was working from home. And it seems like, I mean, there's a lot of women who still work from home and also watch children even in
Hmm.
2024. So that kind of, but I think the pandemic kind of started that. Do you have any thoughts on how the pandemic affected mothers, working mothers specifically?
Yeah, I think specifically childcare was a huge issue because when the world shut down, so did childcare. And who tends to leave work or take a more flexible job or go part time? It's moms, right? And I think they said, I don't remember the stats, but the pandemic disproportionately impacted women. Women were leaving the workforce in droves because they didn't have access to childcare. And not every company allows you to work from home with your kids there. And so it was a huge struggle for so many women. And I think that, the pandemic and the childcare crisis, it just like compounded, right? And it just became unsustainable for so many women to continue to do this work. But I do think it was this reckoning too, where women's eyes were like, wait, so much of this is built on our backs, on this invisible labor that we're doing. And when the world shuts down, we're the ones who have to kind of catch all of this work. And I think it made a lot of moms in particular, but women in general, a little bit mad. And I think that is why you're seeing so many people talk about it because the pandemic, I think it just made us all see the world for what it is, for better or for worse. And as mothers during the pandemic, I think it really highlighted the lack of support that exists, the lack of infrastructure, and how it's hurting us. And ultimately leading to, like you said, burnout. And when you're burnt out at some point, you break down. And I think a lot of women went through that during the pandemic. At least I know I did. I broke down several times, but and I think so much of it is because of that pandemic. And if that hadn't happened, I don't know when I would have come to this realization. I don't think it would have been as soon as
Yeah.
it was.
Yeah, I think so too. From in my own personal experience, because I had Daphne was born in 2020, and then I was on
Yeah.
maternity leave for 4.5 months, and then it was when I was on that maternity leave where I was like, oh my god, how am I going to go back to work and do all these things? And I was also like, daycares were starting to open, but the wait lists were
So long.
so long. So I worked at home with my daughter until she was 11 months old. So the time she was 5 months until 11 months she was working at home with me and that was extreme. Like I look back to that and I was like, I don't know how I even did that
I know.
at the
I did
time.
the same thing
It
with
was
my
just crazy.
2020
Yeah.
baby. I mean, there was no other option.
Yeah, you had to.
What were we
And
supposed to do?
yeah, and just like the level of like burnout, it was just like
Yeah,
unreal. And so I think and that's when I kind of had that realization too of like,
I bet.
okay, how am I going to do this? And I have to work and watch the kids and I have the flexible job cuz I work from home and Cody goes downtown and has to commute. And so it did just a lot of that fall on me.
Mm,
So
it's a
okay.
lot.
So now that you and your husband actually let's talk about this Google spreadsheet. Don't talk
Okay.
about the Google spreadsheet. So you use this Google spreadsheet. I know that you have it linked in your Instagram. I can link it
Hmm.
too in the show
Yeah,
notes.
sure.
Okay. So people can go and save it and then use it for themselves. But let's talk, what is the spreadsheet exactly?
Yeah, so the spreadsheet is from essentially that fair play game. So I'm a fair play facilitator, but also, as I mentioned, fair play was really the catalyst for us having this conversation. What I like about I'm not a card person. Like the game is like cards, and I'm like, this is too hard for me to understand. I need an Excel spreadsheet. I want to see numbers. I want to be able to reference back to it. I want to see like the history of the changes we've made to this document. Like I want to have this here, right? And we've used it. Like I've definitely gone back to this Excel spreadsheet 6 months later and been like, do you remember when you said you were going to own the mail? And now you never check the mail, and I have to check the mail every day. And just like be like, hey, if this isn't working, then we need to talk about it. But essentially it's a spreadsheet, and it lists all of those tasks we talked about earlier. So there's about 100. You are not supposed to. So if you've read Fair Play, you're not supposed to use all 100. Hopefully you don't need all 100 tasks. Most families are probably using like 80, give or take. But they have options for different periods of your life, like a home renovation or a new baby, right? And so you might have subtasks that you want to create on your own that go along with where you are in your life, right? And so but this is a generic list of tasks that will happen in a home. And what I've done is I've basically created columns where you put your name or your partner's name as the owner. And what I did was kind of like there's existing, what it currently looks like, who's owning it now, and what we want the future version to look like. And then it calculates how many each person has. And for us, this was just a really great way to have the conversation, to be able to see the work, to be able to list it out, and to revisit it. Because as you know, you have an older kid now too. Life changes drastically when you hit public school. You know, now you have so
Yeah.
many more activities and days off and half days, and just life gets crazy, and you have all these phases of life. And so you can use this spreadsheet to update. You know, you can add things, remove things that are no longer applicable. You don't have diapers anymore, so get rid of that. And you can constantly be having these conversations, because I think this is an important thing to note. This is not a one and done conversation. You constantly have to revisit this and rebalance in your home, because careers change and kids change and schedules change. And so if you don't have these conversations when these changes happen, you can kind of really slide back into bad habits, and that unequal division of labor will persist if we're not really conscious about it. And so the spreadsheet for me was the best way to keep track of it. And I know I've heard from a lot of people that the spreadsheet helps because the cards, the first time you do it, it's helpful, but like, do you actually walk around with a deck of cards everywhere you go? Probably
Yeah.
not. So
Yeah.
it makes it a little bit more visual and something you can revisit.
Yeah, I like that idea too because we have the cards. We bought the cards. We did it a couple years
Mm-hmm.
ago, and it same. Like you go through it, you do the activity, and then you
Right.
have your cards, and then you like lose a card or you can't really
Yeah.
remember like who has what card, and then you're like sorting through all these cards trying to find it, and it's just like not.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I like the idea of a Google spreadsheet. Cody and I did tell him, I was like, hey, I'm interviewing Paige. We're going to do the Google spreadsheet because, so we're going to do it, I think, this weekend. We're going to have some time and go through it. And like, yeah, your life does change so much from,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have a 7-year-old now and she's downstairs it's fall break. So she's downstairs right now watching TV. And I'm surprised she hasn't even come up yet and asked me for something at this point. But like, it's just like all those little things that, yeah, sometimes when you do have the more flexible job or whatever, it falls on you. And so how do you find the equity in the relationship? Because that's
Mm-hmm.
just how it is, right? Like I
Yeah.
have a more flexible job, so I'm going to be home. He has to go into the office. But how can we make that dynamic feel more fair?
And I think something we haven't talked about, but is equity with time, right? And so, yes, you might have a more flexible job. I have a more flexible job. What that means is 3 days a week, I'm driving back and forth to speech therapy in the middle of the day, right? My husband can't do that with his job. And I'm bringing my laptop with me because I have the flexible job and I can work from anywhere. But what often gets missed in this conversation is time, and time for leisure, time for rest, time for hobbies, time for friends. And oftentimes, what I hear from people is, oh, my husband works in an office and his office has a gym. And so then he'll work out after work or on his lunch break. And the person with the flexible job doing like childcare and work doesn't get that, right? They don't get that moment for themselves. They don't get that leisure. And so when you have this conversation, something I did with my partner too was we also looked at our calendar, and I found 2 nights a week that were mine. And I'm like, I'm out of here. I do mornings by myself every day. I'm clocking out at 6 o'clock. I'm going to hot yoga. I'm going to dinner with a girlfriend. 2 nights a week, mom is out. I am out Mondays and Wednesdays. Obviously, if a kid is sick or something happens, that doesn't happen, right? It doesn't always work out. But they're on the calendar and they're known and they are my time. And my husband gets that as well. The difference is my husband gets home from work at 3:30. The kids don't get home till 5:30. He gets those 2 hours every day, right? I don't get that unless I build it in. And I think that that's hard to do, to have that conversation about building that time, that intentional time into your life, to just be a person outside of being a mom, outside of being a wife, just to be a person. Because we lose so much of that in motherhood, right? Women often say, like, this has consumed my whole identity. Like, all I am is a mother. And we deserve more than that. We deserve time to be more than just a mother and to find the things that bring us joy. And for me, that's yoga or Pilates and seeing my girlfriends. And for others, that might be, I don't know, rock climbing. I don't know. You do what makes you happy. But I think that is a big part of this too. When you start to build more equity on that labor, you'll notice that you find more equity in time if you are intentional about it. It's very easy to feel like you always want to be productive, but rest and hobbies and things like that are super important. And they give you energy to come back and do all these things and be productive in the way that we've been told to be, but with, with also some renewed sense of self, which we all need.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about, I think Eve Rodsky calls it Unicorn Space, is like another
Yes,
book that's
unicorn
talking, and
space.
that's kind of the reward. That is the reward that you get after you create more equity in your relationship, is you have more time for yourself. And I know that's one thing that mothers just really struggle with, is like prioritizing them, like going to hot yoga. I love hot yoga too.
It's the best.
Or going out with girlfriend, or, whatever it may be, just like watching a TV show, like without interruptions, like locking yourself in your
Mm-hmm.
room. I don't know if that
Read a
would work
book.
with young kids because they'll be banging on the door, but like, you know what I'm trying to
Yeah.
say? Like, yeah, just carving out time for yourself. I know I could definitely be better at that. When I was looking at your Instagram page the other day, I saw in your story highlights, you guys, you have to go over to your story highlights. I can't remember what it's called, what you titled it, but you talk about your calendar and you show your shared
Oh
calendar
yeah.
with your husband. And that was so helpful. We are also going to be updating our calendar as well to show, like, you would block out like big stretches of time, like when you're actually working. And when you do it that way, you
Mm-hmm.
can see really the pockets of time that you have. And it's not very much as a mom
No,
or as a
God,
dad, as a
definitely not.
parent. It's not, but it's like but then you do have to be really intentional about when you're going to go and take care of yourself or have alone time or do
Mm-hmm.
whatever. Seeing that like visually really helped me, because there are times where I have time where I can go and do things, but I'm not super intentional about it. So then that time just like ends up passing,
Yeah.
or I'll just start working instead. And so that was really helpful. So go and look at her highlight again. Can't remember what it's called. I'll put it in the show
But
notes. Yeah, but it was very helpful. I was like, okay, this is life changing. Like just seeing how she like puts her Google Calendar together with her husband.
I mean, the Google Calendar, I live and die by it. I know not everybody does, but I do live and die by it.
Yeah.
And now I will say, you're getting into this territory. You've got a 7-year-old. We have the Skylight calendar, and so it's linked to my Google Calendar.
Yeah.
And
We have that too.
we have it, yeah. And so we have it color coded by like kids, mom, dad. And now my kids will like look at it and be like, oh, I've got Taekwondo today, or oh, we have this birthday party today, and they're seeing what's happening in our house too. And that's great, right? I think that's great to get them involved in this, because as they get older, they start to become a part of this conversation, right? Like, hey, dude, you're making your own bed today. Mom is not here to kind of do this for everyone. We're going to have this conversation for kids too, when it's age appropriate to do so. I always like to say, because
Right.
people
Yeah.
always come in my comments and they're like, make your kid pack their backpack. I'm like, well, she's 2. So, I'm not going to do that,
It
but
doesn't really
whatever.
work. Yeah.
Whatever. But yeah, I think the calendar, like, I live and die by calendars. I live and die by my reminders app, which I have an iPhone, and it's just it just exists on your iPhone. I don't know. People are always interested in it, but it's just, I set reminders for myself all day long. And that's, my mental load exists in my reminders app. Literally, I'm looking at it right now and it's like telling me all the things I need to do today. And one of them is turn off your son's alarm clock, because he set an alarm that's going off at like an asinine hour. And I'm like, why did you do this? Like, and he doesn't know how to
My
turn it
daughter
off.
did the
Like,
same thing on her watch.
oh my God. Yes, he has a
Yeah.
watch one that goes off all hours of the day. And now his bedroom one, he was up at like 5. I'm like, what are you doing? No. So I have to, but that's the mental load, right? Remembering to do that. So tomorrow morning, he's not up at 5 again. But yeah, I mean, calendar, reminders. I want to say, like, there's systems that you can put into place that work best for you and your family. And not everybody's system is going to be the same. And that's what works for me. And which is why I share these things. I'm like, hey, if this works, fantastic. If it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work. And that's okay. But I think part of this work, and going through this with a partner is figuring out what does work. How do you stay on the same page about these things? Is it a shared calendar? Do you guys need a visual calendar in your house? What does that look like? And just being really intentional about having those conversations.
Yeah. Perfect. The last thing I want to talk to you about is delegating or outsourcing tasks. Do you do any of that in your household? And
Yeah,
I
I mean,
mean,
we
like,
outsource to like
yeah,
a
yeah,
third party, a person. Yes.
yeah.
Yes, we have a house cleaner that comes every 2 weeks, and we've been with our house cleaner. She's amazing. We love her for probably 7 or 8 years. Like she's amazing. We originally got a house cleaner because we had English bulldogs. I don't know if anybody has had an English. They're so gross. I love them to death. They're the best dogs in the world.
Are
Like
they?
the amount of drool that would be like on my walls. Like I'd be like, what is happening? They were so messy, and I was like, I can't keep up with it by myself. And so we got a cleaner. But honestly, it's amazing. It is a privilege to be able to pay for a cleaner. I acknowledge that. That is something we've outsourced. I think a common misconception, because a lot of men will be like, just hire a house cleaner. A house cleaner coming every 2 weeks is not going to be enough to keep up with the mess that kids make and that you and your partner make. The dishes are still there. There's still crumbs on the floor. Your daughter dropped a yogurt, right? Like you're still cleaning all the time in between. I view house cleaning as like the deep clean, right? Like this is the deep clean that we outsource. And then we
You also
obviously
have to
outsource.
clean before they come. You have to
Oh
pick
my
up the
gosh.
toys so they can vacuum. Like if they
Yes.
so you have to
Yes.
plan and think about that. Cleaners are coming tomorrow, so
Oh
these
my
are the
gosh.
rooms that are dirty. This is what we need to
Mhm.
pick up. It's all the mental
Yes.
load.
My son this morning yelled at his 2-year-old sister. He's like, pick up your stuffies. If the cleaners come today, they're going to vacuum over it. Pick it up. And I was like,
My daughter says the same thing.
I was like, she's fine, babe. They're not coming today. And that's just because I'm always like, if you don't pick this up, it's going to go in the trash.
I do that too.
Whether that's a good parenting move or not, it's worked.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's house cleaning, and then we outsource childcare because we're both working parents. And so, I did the work from home with baby thing that you did. I think it's completely unreasonable to expect people to do a full-time job and watch their kids full-time. We pay for daycare. We pay for after school care. When you have older kids, I pay for camp in the summers, day camp. And so, yeah, we do a lot of outsourcing in the way of childcare. We don't outsource anything else. My husband does all of the yard work and all of that. I do most of the inside stuff with him. Yeah, so unless something's broken, unless
Yeah.
a water heater is broken or something, we're trying to do it ourselves. And yeah, that's it for us.
It's interesting how you said we outsource our childcare. I've never heard it phrased that way. I like that though.
Yeah.
Because you are.
Yeah. And it's funny because I think some people will call it like a paid village. I'm sure you've seen this, especially in the working
Yeah.
mom space. People will be like, my paid village. I don't use that terminology because the village is meant to be reciprocal in a sense, right? So, like in a real village, when you're sick, I make you a meal train. And when I have a new baby, you make me a meal train. And like we're working together like as a community. And I'm not saying that your nanny or your childcare is not part of your community. They very much are. They are so incredibly valuable and important people. And we cherish our childcare workers so much. We love them. But it is a strange dynamic in the sense that you are somewhat of an employer to them, right? And so, yes, you're paying. And so that's why I think about it as somewhat of an outsource, right? Because they're an employee, especially if you have a nanny or something like that. And so I think it is important to remember that too, and to remember that this is their job. And that's how they're showing up to this. And so, because sometimes I think people get a little too friendly and they're like, oh, they wouldn't watch the kids on Saturday, and I thought they loved the kids. And it's like, well, they do, but this is a job, and they're
Yeah.
declining a shift that they don't want. And so, but yeah, so I think about it as outsourcing or hiring somebody to do a job, which it is what it is, and it's one of the most important jobs I think that exists is taking care of young kids and being a teacher and all of those things. And so, it is our most expensive thing in our budget, but it's also the most important one for our family at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, childcare changed my life once my daughter
Yes.
was in full time, and then when my oldest went into full day kindergarten, and I no longer had to pay. I only had to pay childcare for one kid. That was
Game
also
changer.
life changer. It was like I got $1,000 raise a month. Like
Yeah.
I was, yeah,
Amazing.
instead of 2,000, now it's only 1,000. So
And one day I try to tell myself, like, one day the 7-year-old's going to be 12, and they're not going to
yeah,
need a babysitter and all those things. Today's not that day, but one day,
one
one
day,
day,
just like
one day we'll
yes.
get there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Paige. I know this conversation is going to help so many people. Can you share where people can find you on social media?
Yes, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok at She's a Paige Turner. I'm also on YouTube and Facebook, but those are my primary places where I'm engaging. I also just launched a Substack called Lessons Learned, and you'll find it by She's a Paige Turner at Substack. And it's also linked in my bio, and I can give it to Caitlin too.
Yes.
And yeah, and I host a podcast and I do a content series, all of which is linked on my social media. So if you want to find more, that's where you will find it.
Okay, I will link everything in the show notes as well. And yeah, you do have a podcast, and I was on your
Yeah.
podcast a little while ago.
Yes,
So
thank you. You were our
perfect.
first.
Go. I know, I was your first.
You're our
I
first.
forgot that I was the first. Yes. Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. Well, I'm so honored. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. I'll link everything in the show notes, you guys. And if you have any questions or anything, go ahead and shoot me a DM or reach out to Paige, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you.